Hello scholars, welcome. Professor Henkle here. Today we are going to get into marine biology and we'll talk about all the different types of sea life that live on the ocean bottom in all of the various environments. So today is animals of the benthic environment. Benthic, you may ask, what is that? Well, we've talked about it before. There is the benthic, bottom of the ocean, and the pelagic, the open ocean. The benthic environment means relating to or occurring at the bottom of a body of water. Technical definition, more untechnical, for lack of a better word, is going to be bottom of the ocean. It's an area where marine organisms live and interact with each other on, near, or within the seafloor. And there's a variety of habitats, which we run through in this lecture. Rocky shores, sediment-covered shores, the shallow offshore ocean floor, and the deep ocean. We could almost call this lecture Invertebrates of the Sea, or Marine Invertebrates, because most benthic organisms are invertebrates, which means without a bony spine, whereas most pelagic organisms are marine vertebrates or with a spine. So, benthic organisms eat plants and animals. They are consumers, as opposed to producers, which we discussed in a previous lecture, that harness sunlight, use carbon dioxide and water to produce oxygen and energy. That energy produced by these primary producers is then consumed by benthic organisms so that they can power and fuel themselves. How much and where are benthic organisms? Well, 98% of the species richness, the total amount of species in the ocean, are on the ocean floor. Now, that doesn't really intuitively make sense to me. Excuse me. My goodness. That doesn't intuitively make sense to me because when I think about the ocean, I think about sharks and I think about big fish. I think about killer whales. I don't think about crabs and lobsters and shellfish and coral reefs and all the other little individual marine species that are down there, but this is what lives down there. So, of the known 240,000 species in the ocean, 98% of those are benthic organisms. Now, that is a huge number. The distribution of organisms in the ocean is extremely one-sided. 98% are benthos, 2% are pelagic, and of that, we have most along coastlines on the shallow continental shelf. Now, why is that? Let's think about the whole cycle of what marine life needs. It needs energy. Where does that energy come from? Primary producers. What do primary producers need? Sunlight and nutrients. Where is sunlight abundantly available? Near the surface. Where are nutrients available? Near coastlines and areas of coastal upwelling that bring nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface where the light is. So, wherever we have primary productivity, we have abundant marine life. And we see this exhibited on a global map showing us oceanic benthic biomass. A lot of it along coastlines, and then also in these polar regions, especially when the sun comes out once a year in the northern hemisphere, once a year in the southern hemisphere. Now, there's two different types of shores we're getting into, rocky shores and sediment-covered shores. On rocky shores, organisms live on top of the rocks. They're attached to the rocks. And on sediment-covered shores, organisms will burrow into the sand. This creates a variety of adaptations that different marine organisms, benthic organisms, have developed over time to fulfill the niche in which they live in these specific environments. So let's talk about rocky shores. If we zonate the shore, we can say there's the splash zone or supertidal, and then the intertidal, which is the area between high tide, middle tide, and low tide. High tide, usually dry. Middle tide, relatively dry, but exposed at all low tides. And then low tide, usually wet. So differing levels of inundation lead to different adaptations, lead to different marine benthic organisms. Really cool. So in the, excuse me today, I'm so sorry. I don't have my water. Teacher fail. I apologize for that one. But we're going to roll with it. We're just going. Okay, so we got this. On rocky shores, the supertidal zone is going to be the spray zone, and organisms here really have to worry about drying out because an adaptation of marine life is to become mostly water. If you live in the ocean, you become mostly water, then your internal chemistry is similar to the ocean chemistry. You have to work less hard to survive. But that means if you're out of the water, you risk desiccation or drying out. So these animals have shells. There's not much marine algae, which need to be inundated all the time. And you've got rock louse, which is this upper right, and then limpets, which are these aquatic snails. Notice that both of these have shells. The shells are an adaptation for supertidal organisms to avoid desiccation. High tide. Now we've got some marine algae. These are rockweeds with thick cell walls. In this area we can get barnacles and mussels, but as you can see they established later. That means after the middle tide zone. That will make sense soon here. More diversity, but still not as great because it's out of the water. And we're talking about marine life who live in the water. So mostly dry, higher diversity than above the waterline, but still increasing as we go down to the middle tide zone. Sea stars, barnacles, mussels. This is such a cool photo. You can see they're all epifauna clinging to the rock or the substrate. Here we've got greater biomass, greater biodiversity, some soft-bodied animals that can survive in here, and a much greater biomass of marine rocky shore species. Some other cool things, anemones, sea anemones. These are really cool. If you've ever been to the ocean, you can actually touch them, and they've got all these little finger-like things, right? And they're really squishy, and you stick your finger in, and they go, and they suck in as a protection mechanism. It's one of my favorite things to go tide pooling, specifically in Point Lobos, which is kind of near Carmel along the California coast. At low tide, there's a whole suite of rocky shore organisms that you can cruise around and check out. Hermit crabs, they've got armored claws in the upper body, a soft abdomen. They take on abandoned shells from other species. And then you've got sea urchins, which have a fine-toothed mouth, hard to find, the hard spherical shell, and then spines for protection. So, more middle tide zone organisms. Low tide, we've got some different grasses, some different algae. We've got shore crabs that will come down during the low tide to forage and scavenge for food and then go back up to middle and high tide. This area is almost always submerged, and there's a lot of protection from the various types of seaweeds and grasses that are down in this region. So that is our rocky shore. There's the tidal zone, and then there is above the tide, very similar on sediment-covered shores, where we have beaches, salt marshes, and mudflats. These are all composed of sediments. The intertidal zonation is low, middle, high tide, yes. And then we call below and above sublittoral or supralittoral. As for rocky shores, it was supratide and the splash zone. Here it's supralittoral and sublittoral. And we have a gradation of species very similar to rocky shores. So we can see diversity is lower, above, and increases the further down you get because of the stability of the environment, which is also why a lot of these marine species burrow. It's safer down there. It's more stable. There's less risk of predation. So how do they do it? Well, bivalve mollusks, or clams, are organisms with a soft body and a hard shell. Clams and mussels, they will actually extend a foot out of their shell, dig a little burrow, pull themselves down into the water, and then stick another feeding tube or siphon up to filter feed phytoplankton out of the water. What else do we have up here? Annelid worms, which can burrow due to their U shape, and then they actually move the sand through their digestive tract, extracting any energy sources that they might have, any food, as they burrow their way through. Crustaceans have segmented bodies, hard shells, they can bury themselves. Echinoderms, spiny skin, 5 tapered legs, gills, tube feet. They have the same thing, a siphon that can come up. Examples of starfish examples of echinoderms are the heart urchin, which we see here, and then also sea stars, echinoderms, starfish. Very cool. We've got the fiddler crab. I love this. One big claw, which we can see here, and then one tiny claw. Evolution is artistic and beautiful and amazing, and here we have an example of that. Subtidal, away from the tide, always inundated, we get kelp and kelp forests. So kelp, excuse me, kelp are a species of algae, and they attach to the substrate, and they attach with a holdfast, extending stripes and blades for support, having pneumatocysts inside that are going to be small little pockets of air that allow them to float. If you're tide pooling, this is usually not on rocky shores, I find, but on sediment-covered shores, there will be kelp that washes on shore. You can see those little sacs of air. You can smash it with your heel, and they go pop, pop. Kind of fun. No kelp are harmed in the making of it. I think it's fine. It's just playing with nature a little bit. So kelp grows in kelp forests. Kelp forests are extremely important for habitat, as we see here. This harbor seal, they can hide in this area. Fish can hide. It's a shelter, it's protection, and an incredibly diverse and productive ecosystem. Again, located along coastlines, as we can see here, at very specific latitudes. Cool. Okay, kelp need sunlight and nutrients for photosynthesis, and as primary producers, they can provide a lot of support for a lot of various organisms. Rocky bottom, offshore communities, what do we have going on here? Lobsters are so cool. Look at this European lobster with its spiny antennae that lives in water up to 65 feet. It feeds on live animals as well as scavenging. Oysters are a delicacy. People love to eat oysters. Oysters are also commonly under threat because of overharvesting. But with the right environmental policy, we can protect these specific species. Oysters grow by growing, and then they grow out of those shells. I'm so sorry. Onto the next layer, and they'll build an oyster bed on an oyster bed on an oyster bed on an oyster bed, making these big, elaborate structures with the living generation on top of previous generations. Okay, coral reefs. Coral reefs are so cool. Have you ever been scuba diving or snorkeling around a coral reef? Well, if not, there's going to come a day, probably when you graduate, and you get to go on vacation. And I would highly recommend finding somewhere that has a coral reef and snorkeling, because when you put your head underwater, it is a whole new world down there. An amazing world to discover. And so these reefs are shallow water communities that only exist in the tropics. They need very specific temperatures, very specific water chemistry. This is a big problem with climate change, is increasing ocean temperatures and decreasing ocean pH are causing an upset leading to coral bleaching. I probably said that one too soon, but what is a coral reef? Well, it's an organism called a polyp. The polyp actually builds the reef in successive generations as it builds the structure made out of calcium carbonate. So it's directly in tune with the environment, pulling minerals and nutrients out of the ocean water. Inside its tissues, there is a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, a microscopic algae that lives within the tissues, so that algae is the primary producer for the polyp. And the algae inside of the tissues photosynthesizes, creates energy. That energy is consumed by the polyp grows. Algae is protected, polyp gets food. It's a win-win for everybody. So coral and algae have this symbiotic relationship. It's mutualistic. The algae provides food, the corals provide the nutrients. Other reef animals have symbiotic relationships, including mixotrophs, which derive part of their nutrition from algae. So this has included corals, forams, sponges, and mollusks. In these areas of fierce competition, there's also cooperation to help each other to survive, because it's hard down there in these rocky shores sometimes. Okay, who noticed that coral reefs were a thing? Well, the first person, the man himself, Charles Darwin. The theory of evolution. Amazing, right? He was a smart guy. On his 5-year voyage across the ocean as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, where he just sat on that boat and just looked at things and thought about things and collected samples and looked at them and cataloged them and mailed them back home and made fortunes off of it, and but provided him the time to actually write his book on the origin of species, where he laid down the theory of evolution with the mechanism of natural selection. He did a lot of things along the way. One of them was writing the structure and distribution of coral reefs. He was the first person to identify the evolution of coral reefs, and it goes like this. Here's a volcanic island, and around this volcanic island, a fringing coral reef starts to develop. We see this today. If you go to Hawaii, there's fringing coral reefs. Over time, volcanism stops, erosion happens, and what you get is a small lagoon between the island and the reef that was there previously. Now, this is called a barrier reef, and we see these currently around the world. Also, the Great Barrier Reef, yes? Here we go. Over time, that island completely erodes into a seamount, so it's underneath the surface, leaving only the lagoon behind the barrier reef. This is now an atoll. So the sequence of events: fringing reef, barrier reef, and atoll. Pretty cool. We see these all over the world. Charles Darwin, a couple hundred years ago, first person to recognize it. Coral reefs are an indicator. If our oceans are an indicator of the health of the earth, our coral reefs are an indicator of the oceans. And so it's an early warning sign because they house a great diversity of species. They protect shorelines, they're important for marine fisheries, and they're very important tourist destinations because they're beautiful. Here we can see a turtle. There's some brain coral, more brain coral, all different types of coral. And here's a fish in here also. That turtle looks like he's going for him, actually. It's the circle of life. It's okay. I don't know what ended up happening here. Coral reefs are in danger, as we'll see extensively in our documentary. But the process of eutrophication, which is excess nutrients input into these oceanic systems from human effects on land, can cause too many nutrients in coral reefs. That clouds the water, makes it muddy, too much primary productivity, overwhelming phytoplankton. Next thing you know, we're going to get coral bleaching, which is the loss of color because the zooxanthellae die, leave, or become toxic. Coral need their microscopic photosynthetic algae inside of their tissues. And if those algae leave, the coral die and they lose their color. And it leads to coral bleaching. So directly connected to climate change, ocean warming, because of high surface water temperatures, increased ultraviolet levels, decreased sunlight blocking atmospheric particles, marine pollution, this is a huge one, salinity changes, and disease. But coral bleaching is a natural thing, as not everything in the world just always flourishes out of control. There are natural checks and balances that lead to equilibrium, homeostasis, sustainability. What we see, though, during El Nino events, which is large storm events, huge floods. Those huge floods bring all kinds of junk from the land and deliver it to the ocean, and that stuff in the ocean leads to significant coral bleaching events. We've seen this happen over and over again. So the science is here. The data is there. This is one more line of evidence for us to say, oh, human impacts are affecting the climate, and that those effects are in turn having negative consequences on biodiversity, increasing extinction rates to way above background levels. Humans are the greatest threat. Trash, carbon dioxide, runoff, basically everything we do without checking our practices. But we can check our practices. We can implement environmental policy. We can vote for politicians who have a marine agenda. Someone who says, I think the Earth's oceans are important. We need to protect them and create some marine protected areas. There are ways that we can go ahead and help our oceans. And I won't get too deep into the politics of it, but there's ways. It's not all doom and gloom, I promise. There are ways that we can help our oceans. We'll talk about them. Okay, so let's go to the deep ocean physical environment. It's pretty stable in temperature, pressure, high pressures, high dissolved oxygen, high nutrient levels, but no light. All of that exists. There's this interesting feature that there's no primary productivity because it's so low. There's very special adaptations for food, and a lot of the food comes from fish falling, from different pelagic organisms falling from the open ocean and landing on the ocean bottom. Now, it's been speculated that there's as many as 10 million species that may inhabit the deep sea. This biodiversity is comparable to the tropical rainforest. Now, we don't know because we don't know a lot about the deep ocean. We don't have a deep sea not space station, a deep sea station down there, although that would be cool. The ocean is big and there's a lot to learn. And so while right now there may be this, I can foresee in 50 years, 100 years, we probably will have a deep sea station down there. And this slide will not be speculative, but it'll be, here's what the biodiversity of the deep ocean is. But at this point, we don't know. And it might be could be your life's work. You might be an engineer who designs the deep sea oceanographic research station and spends your life there understanding what the marine biology of the deep ocean is. It's a pretty cool thought. So what's down here? Hydrothermal vents. We've talked about them many, many times. These are basically chimneys that emit smoke along mid-oceanic ridges, and that smoke provides the basis of the food web. They were discovered in 1977 by the submersible Alvin, trivia fact, and it was completely by accident. Nobody knew there was hydrothermal vents. This is why pure research is so great. Let's just go out and explore and see what we can find. Well, Alvin found hydrothermal vents. These hydrothermal vents had giant tube worms, giant clams, giant mussels, giant crabs, microbial mats. Whoa! Extremely diverse areas living in these superheated chimneys without light. Wait, but if there was no light, who was photosynthesizing? Well, no one was. In fact, there's microscopic archaea, which thrive on hydrogen sulfide. So instead of sunlight, it's hydrogen sulfide. We call this process chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis, let me check in right here. Perfect. Forms the basis of these deep sea hydrothermal vent food webs. Chemosynthesis creates the energy that is then eaten by the consumers, by the clams and the tubes and the mussels and the crabs and all the other stuff that's down there. So these vents can be active for years or decades, and we're still learning a lot about these too. So this could be your area of research. They're populated all over the ocean with very similar organisms that are attached. So how does it get from one to the other? Well, broadcast spawning, yes. These larvae might drift from site to site or kind of catch a ride along dead whales. Whales die in the ocean, they travel to the bottom. They become micro ecosystems for a little while that could be like stepping stones for the distribution of marine organisms to populate new chimneys as they come up. Still learning. Lots to learn, really cool stuff here. The vents need volcanic activity. When the vent goes out, the organisms die. If there's too much volcanism, the organisms die. It's a very sensitive, very truly amazing phenomenon that these deep sea hydrothermal vents support biocommunities. Shout out. There's also a few areas on Earth that have deep sea chemosynthetic communities fed by hydrocarbons and methane. One of them is along the Florida escarpment. This is a hypersaline seep, which basically shallow continental floor emits material that provides the basis of the food web. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's hydrocarbon seeps, and then along the Juan de Fuca plate, there are folded sedimentary rocks that contain methane. That methane actually feeds the producers, creating these low temperature seep communities. There may be more life in the deep ocean substrate, the rocks underneath the ocean. There's hypotheses that life began in the rocks, not in the oceans. Where did life begin? From space, from the oceans, from hydrothermal vents, from deep inside the Earth's rocks? We may never know. We've got our ideas. Right now, the prevailing hypothesis, the theory is life began in the oceans, as demonstrated by the Stanley Miller-Urey experiment in Earth's primordial soup somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago. But there may be more life here. We haven't been down there. Another area of frontier research. So the benthic environment includes an incredible amount of diversity. This diversity is mainly along coastlines, but also distributed along the deep ocean floor in various hydrothermal vent and deep sea communities. And marine life has adapted to the conditions of these various environments to produce such great biodiversity. So thank you, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.